Everyone wants to find their ancestors' ship manifest. In many cases, it's the very first piece of evidence proving that your relative came from another country. And no matter how many dozens and dozens and dozens of ship manifests I look at, I always get a similar sense of awe and wonder when I see them. Because I imagine what this person must have had to go through in order to get to the place where they were on that day. But finding them is not always so easy. Ship manifests are one of the most common dead ends people run into while looking for their relatives. And sometimes it boils down to a matter of luck, but majority of the time, it actually comes down to the tactics and tricks being used by the person researching the relative. Welcome to Genealogy is Fun. I'm Yonah Paley, a professional genealogist, and on today's episode, we're going to be figuring out how to find your ancestors' ship manifests. The first thing I want to emphasize about finding ship manifests, like finding any documents, is that it ultimately boils down to a process of elimination. Keep in mind that between the years 1880 and 1924, there were almost 3 million Jewish immigrants to the United States. Most of them came fleeing pogroms, which were anti-Jewish uprisings that were taking place all across the Russian Empire. So how do you take that number of 3 million, and even more if you're researching people who immigrated after the 1920s, and narrow it down to your great-grandfather? First things first, you want to figure out when they arrived. And sometimes this is going to be an easy thing to figure out, and other times it's going to be difficult. For instance, my great-great-grandfather Reuben Kushner's naturalization documents show that he arrived the 15th of February 1907, sailing aboard a ship called the Majestic. Now, just because somebody's naturalization documents mention that they arrived on a certain date or on a certain ship doesn't mean that this information is all necessarily going to be correct. In this instance, it is correct. But in other cases, the date might be correct, but the ship might be wrong, or vice versa. But let's say we were not able to find naturalization records, or let's say the naturalization records gave really inconclusive information, like it didn't give the name of the ship or the date of arrival. Then we would turn to census records, and census records are really useful as well, because they usually give an estimated year of arrival for immigrants. Reuben's 1910, 1920, and 1930 census all put his year of arrival as 1906. His 1915 census puts it as 1907, and his 1925 census puts it as 1908. So it seems to be pretty consistent that he arrived between 1906 and 1908. Now, let's say we were to take the information we know about Reuben and now try to find his ship manifest. Well, on a site like Family Search, you're able to put a range of years in for somebody's birth. And I happen to know that Reuben was born around 1872, but we'll give him a nice cushion of a few years just to be safe. The ship manifest doesn't seem to be showing up, so we're going to need to use some creativity in the form of wildcards. Wildcards are search functions designed to replace characters or multiple characters, and they can be really useful when you don't know exactly how something is spelled. You can use a question mark in order to replace one character, and you can use an asterisk to replace multiple characters. When we replace the middle letters of Reuben's name with an asterisk, the database knows that his name begins with an R and ends with an N. But anything in the middle is up for grabs. Since this still doesn't help us find the manifest, let's try it with his last name. Voila! Whoever transcribed Reuben's manifest put his first name as Rinvin, and his last name was spelled with an SCH instead of just an SH. The spelling of Reuben's name as Rinvin probably boils down to a simple mistake, which is that Reuben's Yiddish name was Reuven, and they probably just misspelled Reuven with a V and put an IN instead of a U. Wildcards can be used for most documents on sites like Ancestry and Family Search, and they're one of the most useful tools for figuring out how things may be indexed, even when you don't know how they're spelled. Remember, you're at the mercy of record keepers and transcribers, and sometimes the spelling that you think is going to be the one that shows up on the document ends up not being the one. It's also important to note that people did not give the same significance to spelling of names and last names as they used to, especially when you're dealing with immigrants from the 1880s, 1920s time period. So it is not entirely uncommon for two people with the last name Cohn to immigrate, and then one of them goes by it with a C and one goes by it with a K. This is because a lot of these names are transcribed and transliterated from languages like Yiddish, German, Polish, and Russian. So it's already an approximation, and there is no correct way to spell it in English. Now, this is all well and fine, but what if you don't know your ancestor's Yiddish name? After all, when they're immigrating from Eastern Europe, they're most likely going to be arriving under their original Yiddish name rather than the anglicized one that they chose later on. Now, the best way to do this is by having a look at their gravestone. As I've touched on before, Jewish gravestones are one of the most useful genealogical tools available because they often have the person's Hebrew name and the name of their father. But there's one important distinction that you're going to have to make when using this tool to try to find your ancestorship manifest, and that is the distinction between Hebrew and Yiddish names. There are many names in Yiddish and Hebrew that mean the exact same thing, and an ancestor might go by both of them at certain points. If someone's gravestone lists their name as Tzvi, they're probably going to be listed on the ship manifest under the name Hirsch. Hirsch and Tzvi are both the same name. They both mean deer, like the animal. But Tzvi is the Hebrew version and Hirsch is the Yiddish version. The same goes for common names like Zev and Wolf, Yaakov and Yankel, Yosef and Yossel, and the list goes on. Someone emigrating from a Yiddish-speaking country will usually have their Yiddish name on the ship manifest, but sometimes their gravestone will have their Hebrew name. So it's important to get familiarized with the different types of name variations that exist. Now, if you can't get their name from a gravestone, there is always the nuclear option, and that is trying to approximate what their Yiddish name would be. Now, this is not always the easiest thing to do, and it's not going to be effective 100% or maybe even most of the time. But there are some patterns that you can pick up on of anglicized names that Yiddish immigrants choose to replace their original names. So for instance, Moshe often becomes Morris, Philip would be something like Fievel or Fischel, Jenny is often an approximation of Shana, and there's like a billion of these, and like I said, it's not a 100% or like a 1-to-1 ratio where you're definitely going to know what their Yiddish name is. But if you have no other way of finding out your ancestor's name, this occasionally works. And at the minimum, it's going to help give you some insight into Jewish naming patterns. That's one of the most beautiful things about genealogy. It's the learning machine that keeps on giving. If you value your time, you should always try to work your way down from the easiest to the least easiest methods of research. Imagine that you spent 3 hours trying to guess the name of your great-grandfather, only to find out that his naturalization document had a copy of his ship manifest attached to it and mentioned lots of details, including his original Yiddish name. Yeah, I've been there, and we've all been there, and it's not fun. So try to take the path of least resistance. At some point, you're going to have to use some tools and hustle in order to figure out a name. But start easy and gradually work your way towards more difficult methods of finding things. There are a ton of extra tips and tools that can be used to find ship manifests, and we could spend all day listing them one by one. But before we finish this video, I want to give you a few of the ones that I've found have helped me with my research, and they can help you too. When searching by European city of origin, it's important to remember that a lot of cities and shtetls went through name changes and even changes of country that they were incorporated in. So for instance, if you have ancestors from Vilnius, Lithuania, but they arrived in the year 1900 to the United States, well then they were actually from a city called Vilna in the Russian Empire. So it's important when you're finding out where your family came from to familiarize yourself with the different naming variations of that town. JewishGen has an incredible town finder tool to help you learn the names and places of cities at various points throughout history. At some point, we're going to go in more detail about this town finder tool, but for now, just remember that it's a priceless asset for figuring out what the name of the city your family might have been from was called when they arrived. The National Archives, available at archives.gov, contains a lot of useful genealogical sources, but one of the most useful are their A files. So immigrants to the United States who became naturalized after the year 1944 had these documents called A files, which contain a huge amount of information, and the only caveat is that you have to look for it to make sure it exists through archive.gov's database, and then you have to pay a fee to them for them to retrieve it to you. But then they'll send these things to you, and sometimes you get like a 10 or even 15-page long document containing lots of information, such as family members who lived in the United States who also immigrated, but most importantly, for these topics, you'll find information about their ship manifest and when they came to the United States. The last tip is a simple one, but it's one you do not want to overlook, and that is that a lot of ship manifests, particularly those from the year 1908 and onward, have a second page of information for each passenger. Sometimes these second pages contain really cool details, such as the place that the person was born, as well as the names of relatives who might be living either in the old country or in the United States. In conclusion, ship records for Jewish ancestors may seem difficult to find at first, but the more you learn, the easier it will become, and soon you'll be coming face to face with your relatives. And that wraps up this video. If you liked it, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.